Welcome and thank you for joining us for our Zoom conference titled Driving Down Driver's License Revocations, and a happy Juneteenth to everyone. Everyone at Safe and Just Michigan is thrilled you are participating. We have muted your microphones to ensure that everyone can hear the panel, but please ask any questions you have using the chat function on Zoom. You'll find the chat function on the taskbar when you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen. For anyone who has not used Zoom before, the chat button is the one that looks like a talk balloon. At the end of the panel, we will gather up and answer questions for as long as time allows. We'll be putting links to an exit survey and ways to get in contact with us at the screen at the end of the panel discussion, but you will also be able to find these links during the event in the chat room. You'll also be posting polls throughout the event.
There's several hundred on here.
For those of you who want to revisit the discussion,
Several hundred, yeah, vote.
For those of you who want to revisit the discussion, we are streaming this event on the Safe and Just Michigan Facebook page through Facebook Live, and we put up on the Safe and Just Michigan YouTube channel later today or tomorrow. You can also engage with us on our social media channels or visit our website. John?
Thanks, Josh. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today to talk about this really important issue to people of Michigan. We have a wonderful panel assembled. And I'm going to introduce them now, and I'll give them the opportunity to introduce themselves as well. So first we have Representative Brana Colley, who's represented the 57th District in the Michigan House since 2017. Representative Colley is sponsoring two jails task force bills, HB 5846, which eliminates driver's license suspensions for violations unrelated to dangerous driving, and HB 5853, which decriminalizes a number of motor vehicle misdemeanors. Representative Colley previously owned a small business providing home care for seniors and other vulnerable people. Next, we have Kristine Longstreet, who is a supervising attorney in the Neighborhood Defender Service in Detroit. Kristine is a former candidate for district court judge in the 36th Judicial District in Michigan. She's been a public defender for over 20 years, with more than 18,000 hours of criminal litigation experience. Next is David Guenthner, who's the Senior Strategist for State Affairs at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. David is the center's first full-time government affairs lead and worked previously at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, serving first as Senior Communications Director and then as Senior Director of Public Affairs. David's background is in politics, policy, communications, and he's been quoted in media outlets as diverse as the New York Times, the O'Reilly Factor, Atlantic Monthly, and the Christian Science Monitor. Finally, we have Geoffrey Leonard, a staff attorney in the Legal Services and Advocacy Division of the Detroit Justice Center. Prior to joining DHC, Jeff worked for the Service Employees International Union, serving as counsel to the Fight for 15 campaign to organize fast food workers. He has also served as a co-chair of the policy committee of Law for Black Lives DC, a legal collective that supports Black-led organizing for liberation and justice in DC. So before I jump into questions, I want to ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves further and tell us a little bit about how they came to be involved in criminal justice work. Representative Colley, would you like to start?
Yes, I would. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and for all the work that has been done collaboratively to bring us to this day. It's exciting. A big reason why I became interested in Michigan's huge license suspensions issues is because it represents a common sense criminal justice reform that will strengthen our economy, bottom line, and it will also increase workforce participation. I think in spite of COVID-19 and the impact that that has had on us, there is still a shortage of workers to fill good paying jobs. Criminal justice reform advances those important goals of strengthening our economy and increasing workforce participation. It also does this without impacting public safety, which is important. And finally, a healthy economy helps people. So those four things, it's a win, 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 win. One thing to note in this conversation today is that dangerous drivers should still face suspension. I think most of us will agree on that as we look through this, but it has become crystal clear, and the info that you hear today will support that the current practice we have of suspending a driver's license for non-dangerous reasons is having a negative impact on our state. So as a former small business owner, as you mentioned, I'm very aware of the challenges that license suspensions makes for people who are trying to get a job and for people who are trying to keep a job. And we want the people of Michigan to be working, to be able to put food on the table, and to be able to take care of their families, to be contributing, tax-paying members of our community, and to know the dignity of a good paying job. So in large part, it's for economic reasons that I got involved. And it's the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. And as I said before, a healthy economy helps people.
Thanks so much, Representative Colley. I'm going to go to Kristine Longstreet next. Kristine?
So I got into criminal defense work. I don't want to say by accident, but my thought was that I was going to be a trial attorney, right? And so in law school, I had the opportunity to do an internship at the State Defender's Office, the then Public Defender's Office for Michigan. And I learned that I wouldn't be trying a lot of cases, but I will be helping a lot of people. And coming from Detroit, and from one of those zip codes, there aren't any, or there, I should say there are few people that I know who have not been touched by the criminal justice system in some way, shape, or form. And so, you know, I consider it an honor and a privilege to be able to work in this system to right some of the wrongs.
Thanks so much, Kristine. I'm going to go to David Gunther next.
Well, as John had mentioned, I joined the Mackinac Center about 2 years ago. I'd previously spent my career at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, but my first exposure to criminal justice reform came back in 2005 when I was a government relations person at the Texas Workforce Commission, which had at that point 27 different programs dealing with various aspects of employment. And one of the programs to which I was assigned was the Project Rio program, which was trying to help with prisoner reentry. It gave me a pretty eye-opening exposure to the challenges that people have coming out of prison, being able to be reemployed. And then as soon as I arrived at the Texas Public Policy Foundation in 2007, we had the big inflection point in Texas where at the very start of the legislative session, the Texas prison system, which already had 170,000 beds, the Legislative Budget Board forecast that at current crime rates and current rates of parole and recidivism, that over the next 5 years, we need to build 17,000 more. And operating under a mandate from both the governor and legislative leadership, we set about doing serious data research on the problems with the criminal justice system and ended up, instead of spending the $3 billion to build and operate the new prisons, we spent about $150 million on diversion programs and alternatives to incarceration. And 5 years later, we needed no additional prison beds. Over the next 5 years, Texas closed 8 prisons. And the example that Texas used in that became an inspiration to other red states, and in fact inspired the Mackinac Center to add criminal justice policy to its portfolio. About a year ago, the person who had been handling our criminal justice policy decided to take a corporate position, and at that point in time, I added criminal justice policy to my own portfolio because of the exposure and the experience that I had with that. A lot of our motivations in the criminal justice space align with what Representative Colley said. Being smarter about how we do policy in a way that promotes public safety, that saves taxpayer money, and increases the opportunities for people who have been exposed to the criminal justice system and are coming out of it to be able to have better employment, better housing opportunities, earn their success.
Thanks so much, David. And I'll tell you, as someone who works in Lansing, it's been really encouraging for me to see bipartisan interest in reforms like this one. I'm going to go finally to Jeff Leonard. Jeff, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Geoffrey Leonard. I'm, as said, a staff attorney at the Detroit Justice Center. I also ended up a little bit involved in this issue a bit accidentally. I moved to Michigan 2 years ago when my partner got a job out here. And I got a job at the Detroit Justice Center. And our sort of model was that we were representing people who were referred to us by job training programs and other social service sites who had candidates who were ready to go back to work, and who either because of outstanding warrants for their arrest or because of driver's license suspensions couldn't find a job or were at very high risk if they did find a job and were able to get there, that they were going to be rearrested. A lot of these people were people who had just gotten out of prison, but a lot of them were just poor people who had driver's license suspensions because they were poor. And so in trying to get them to get licenses reinstated, sort of I came into this thinking, how hard could that be? I'm assuming it's some paperwork and maybe a hearing, and then finding that they were mired in this sort of really, really intense system of surveillance and arrest throughout numerous district courts all over the Metro Detroit area. You know, I think something that's interesting in this conversation is that 60% or maybe 70% of Detroiters actually have to work outside of Detroit because the way Detroit has been sort of strategically disinvested in means that a lot of jobs are no longer in Detroit. And then Detroit is very segregated, and the history of racial segregation and racial profiling and policing means that people are constantly stopped, and typically poor people from Detroit who are constantly stopped, and that leads them to have tickets that they can't afford to pay, and that leads to license suspensions. And it's not the only, you know, I think it's important to remember that it's not the only path to license suspension. And we'll talk about that later, but I think in doing that work, we realized that this was so much bigger than just connecting people with lawyers for individual representation. I mean, I think the common sense ending license suspensions policy we've talked about here is a big part of it. There's also a huge number of other issues that are facing our clients, so that all stem from the fact that we respond to poverty in this country with policing and jails, and that's it, right? We don't provide programs of social uplift. We don't provide housing or jobs that pay well. All we do is throw people in jail or stop people by the police. So I think that's how I came to this issue.
Yeah, and I'm glad you've given me a really great segue into the conversation by previewing some of the issues we're going to talk about. I mean, I didn't know a ton about driver's license suspensions until the task force issues, really. I mean, but some of the things we learned from this task force, I mean, half of all criminal cases in Michigan are traffic offenses. And the third leading cause of admission to jail in Michigan, driving with a suspended license, driving without a valid license. It's just staggering the numbers of people that are caught up in these really, as you say, poverty-related issues. So I'll go to you, Jeff, first. Could you just give us a quick introduction about like the scope of the driver's license suspension problem in Michigan?
My internet cut out for just 1 second. Did you ask the scope of the driver's license suspension?
That's right, yeah. Go ahead.
Sure. So I think somebody else said this. I think it was the state rep, whose last name I apologize, I can't pronounce. Mentioned that it's sort of, people hear driver's license suspensions and they think safety. Like, I've had this conversation with my dad a lot for some reason about what I do. He's like, well, what did they do? Like, what did they get in an accident? And it's like, it's interesting. I think, to me, I always point out that the thing that we think of when we think of safety on the road mostly is, I think, DUIs, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind. And contrasting what we're talking about here with DUIs is, if you get a ticket for anything, right, a speeding ticket, which I think most of us, given that the posted speed limit is 60, everybody drives 80, we're going to get a speeding ticket at some point in our life. If you don't pay that speeding ticket, your license is automatically indefinitely suspended, additional fines and fees are added, and you cannot legally drive. It is a crime for you to drive until you're able to pay off that ticket. Whereas if you get charged with a DUI, convicted with a DUI, you get eventually, pretty quickly actually, something called a restricted license, which lets you drive to work, lets you drive to court, lets you drive to treatment. And so the penalty for the sort of gold standard for safety related driving issues, the penalty is actually way less severe than being too poor to pay a speeding ticket. And I think, to talk just sort of a little bit more about it, I think it's 360,000 people have their licenses suspended either because they failed to pay a traffic ticket of some kind. And then the sort of other thing that happens is if you don't go to court on a criminal traffic matter. So a lot of people don't think about this, but some seemingly pretty innocuous things are actually misdemeanors still under the traffic code. So I forget, there's some aspect of your registration, if it's not correct, you can be charged with a misdemeanor. And then it's not even a ticket, right? It's not a traffic ticket that you get, you have to pay, end of discussion. It's a misdemeanor. And so if you don't go to court to defend yourself against that misdemeanor, and when I say misdemeanor, I mean up to $500 in fines and up to 93 days in jail. They also suspend your license until you go to court. And I think, just to highlight why people don't go to court, right? I have clients who can't get to court because they have suspended licenses, right? So it's like, you don't go to court, your license is suspended. How am I supposed to get to court to resolve my suspension without potentially getting pulled over? We actually literally had a client get pulled over on his way to court to resolve his one suspension, not make it to court, and get another suspension for that stop. And then I think I just point out that there are a ton of other, they don't have each as broad of an impact as the failure to pay, but there are a ton of other suspensions that have nothing to do with driving safety. Unpaid child support can lead to a license suspension. And I think, again, we think of unpaid child support, we think of this sort of silly stereotype of deadbeat dads, but we also represent people in child support proceedings. And the way child support is calculated and the way child support is set up, a lot of people, for example, clients of mine, have unpaid child support because they were incarcerated and they were unable to get their child support reduced while they were in jail. And so they were charged child support every month that they were in prison, and they come out a few years later, they have an unpayable debt and their license is suspended. And that's a whole other conversation about how child support works. But I think it's another example of even if the person is sort of just choosing to not pay child support, all suspending their license does is put them in a place where they're not going to be able to work to pay that child support. So it's a totally ineffective enforcement mechanism. And then it's a penalty for drug crimes sometimes. And then the other one that I think is really strange is I've seen clients who have license suspensions because a car was used in a felony, right? So they were convicted of a felony and it was determined that a car was used in it. And what that means is they were pulled over and drugs were found on them. A felony quantity of drugs were found on them. It was an offense that was, it was like their third offense or something, or a handgun was found on them. And their license was suspended because they incidentally were in a car when they were charged with that, right? They were incidentally driving a car. And that, again, has nothing to do with public safety. And all it does is put people in a position where once they are trying to turn their life around, they can't, because they can't drive legally. They can't get to work. And it poses a barrier to them. So I think I just flagged that. And then lastly, I'll say the driver's license suspensions really are a sort of a tip of the iceberg on this, right? Because there are a number of ways in which just being poor and trying to drive to work can land you in jail. And I think the task force has taken up a number of bills that address that. But
yes. Yeah, and the 350,000 number, just to center that for the audience, I mean, that we have 10 million people in this state. That is 3.5% of the state population annually is having their driver's license suspended for reasons unrelated to driver safety. It's just a huge problem for people in their daily lives, and there's no public safety justification for it. So I want to go to Representative Colley next. Can you tell us a little bit about the process the task force went through to gather the data and information necessary to make the recommendations?
Yeah, thank you. I first heard about the task force last April. That would be April of 2019, not just 2 months ago, April. And I was immediately impressed by the diversity of perspectives. There was included on that task force just a broad spectrum of stakeholders from across the system. It included judges, it included law enforcement, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, a victim's advocate, and several people that have been directly impacted too by the justice system. It also included two of my House colleagues, Representative Mueller and Representative Yancey, that were on the task force as well. I learned from them that before starting this process, no one in Michigan really had accurate information. We didn't have good numbers. No one really knew exactly how many people were coming to jail. No one really knew for what reasons exactly people were coming to jail, and also didn't really even know how long they were staying. So I commend the work of the task force, even for getting us some accurate data and information. So the task force analyzed the data, talked to dozens of experts, and heard testimony from nearly 200 people from across the whole state of Michigan to get answers to different questions, especially the questions that I just mentioned. How long we're staying in jail? Why are they in jail? For what reasons? So relevant to today's discussion, some of the people were regular citizens. I think Geoffrey alluded to some of this, some of the reasons that regular citizens get caught in this system and have their license suspended. They're trying to get to work. They're trying to take care of their families, pay child support, as he mentioned, and they had their license suspended and they struggled to get it back, and it becomes a cycle. So they shared some powerful testimony through the work of the task force. I would just mention a personal story. I not only had a small business that was a home care business, and we had caregivers that went in the home taking care of older adults mostly. I was also the former director of a senior center in our area. And I remember specifically a couple that had a grandson. This was really my first personal experience with this whole scenario that we are talking about. And they would have to leave at random times when we would have activities at the center, because they were the ones that were responsible, and I commend them for doing it, to get their grandson to and from work. You know, they took on that task at their elderly age to get him to and from work, because the area that we live in, like much of the state of Michigan, is very rural. There is no public transportation outside of the little town that I'm in. And the only way that you can get to and from work if you have a suspended license is if someone is kind enough, like a family member, to take you. And their situation led me to think, what about all of the hundreds of thousands of people that don't have a family member to help them out? They can't pay that child support. And by the way, this grandson did have to pay child support. And his grandparents were concerned about their great-grandchildren in this whole picture. So this just shows that, in the testimony that we heard during the task force meetings, it shows that the issue of license suspensions doesn't just affect what you might stereotypically think is scofflaws. This really affects bus drivers and construction workers and moms and dads and regular everyday citizens that were kind of caught up in this system that doesn't always apply common sense.
Yeah.
So it's important. It can have a serious negative impact on their lives, and I think Geoffrey talked about that very well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to go to David next. David, can you tell us what the task force found regarding driver's license suspensions?
I think this was the biggest eye-opener for me when I was looking at the task force report, because they dug into jail admissions and they came up with a list of the top 10 offenses of someone at a point of jail admission. And I'll just read them off real quick. Operating under the influence, assault, driving without a valid license, theft, probation or parole violation, possession or use of a controlled substance, obstruction of justice, other person offense, domestic violence, delivery or manufacture of a controlled substance. To borrow a song from a childhood television show, one of these is not like the others. And you know, when you have the failure or the driver without a valid license showing up as number 3 on the list, that's a huge amount of resources at the local level that are being spent on chasing people who really are not the threat to public safety that the others are. One of the areas where we've tried to differentiate in criminal justice policy is the difference between punishing people who we're afraid of versus punishing people we're mad at. You look at the list of reasons that driver's licenses can be suspended in the state of Michigan, most of those fall on the side of the we're mad at equation. You mentioned failure to pay court-imposed fines and fees on time, or not showing up for a hearing to pay those fines and fees. That's the biggest cause of driver's license suspensions. You've got minor drug offenses, including possession of small amounts of illicit drugs. Failure to pay child support. Now, I would note about that the federal government preempts a lot of the ability for us to do things in that regard because of the support they provide for states to administer child support systems. So that's a conversation that would need to take place with members of Congress as far as trying to make changes in that. But you know, it's important that most of these things are not the imminent direct threats to public safety, like driving 115 in a 55, or the sorts of drunk driving things that would be reasons, okay, yeah, we need to let you sit in jail for a little while and think about what you did. These are the types of offenses that ironically make it less likely that someone will be able to meet their obligations.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't make sense. Thank you, David. So turning from data to stories and examples, Kristine, you mentioned you've been working in criminal justice for over 20 years. Could you share a couple examples of client cases that involve suspended licenses and you know, the circumstances and how they played out?
So I think that one of the things that is very interesting is that, especially in this time where we see people interacting with the justice system for relatively minor offenses, right? And so for me, most of my work is in felony defense. But what you do see is you see the stop, much like we see in Atlanta now, right? Okay, so the police encounter someone and they're driving without a license and, you know, maybe no insurance. And that becomes an arrestable offense, right? And so then you have to begin to discuss the human cost of being arrested and what that does to someone who is just trying to make it from the next moment to the next moment. And so, like you saw in Atlanta, sometimes that can make an individual react in a certain way, because who wants to go to jail, right? Right or wrong, who wants to go to jail? I am reminded when I first started of a case, and I can see this young lady's face, but she was a single mother, 3 kids, right? She was working at a hotel in one of the suburbs, right? And so she started off with a license and a car, and she got stopped, I think, and she got a ticket because she didn't have insurance, and she got a civil infraction. This led ultimately to the suspension of her license because, like Geoffrey said, she couldn't pay the fines. She couldn't get the insurance. She ended up having to continue to go to work, right? And so then she has to make a decision, right? And these are the calculus that poor people make every day. Like, I need to get to work, so I need to do A, B, and C to get to work. So initially she relied on family and friends, but okay, so she found a way to take 3 buses and walk, you know, 1.5 miles to get to where she needed to be. And so it is amazing to me. The story starts where she is on her way home. She's relying on public transportation. She has a neighbor who says, I'll watch the kids, but the neighbor has to leave. And so the neighbor ends up leaving and telling her, I gotta leave. And she says, well, okay, I'll be home in maybe 40 minutes or whatever the time frame was. But she had 3 small children. One of the children left the house. The police were called and she lost custody of the children, right?
Oh, no.
And so she ended up going through the system to try to get her kids back. But in that process, she decided, this is another calculus. Okay, I just have to drive to work. I can't risk missing appointments, still with no license. And so she gets pulled over and she doesn't have a license. And she ends up in a scuffle with the police. And she came to me charged with a felony, resisting and obstructing, right? And so that is 100% a full circle moment, right? Or you talk about, I could go on and on, you know, talking about someone who says, well, I'm not going to drive. I'm going to walk to the store to get my kids Pampers or whatever. And the police, you know, stop them as they do, and they find a taser. Now you have a felony charge of a taser. I mean, there is not one single thing that is not impacted by not having the ability to drive, because realize this, it's freedom. It is a freedom that the ordinary citizen may take for granted, but people in poverty or people in certain areas don't have that freedom.
Yeah, that is a great point. And it's so important for people to understand, because we always talk about driving as a privilege and not a right, but we've built our state in a way that makes it essential for daily life. And I think the way we regulate traffic doesn't reflect that reality. You know, the fact that half of our criminal cases are traffic offenses is crazy to me. I don't mean to editorialize, but this whole issue is just striking for me. Thank you, Kristine. I want to go to Jeff next. Your organization represents a lot of clients who have spent time in jail pre-trial. Can you tell us more about the negative effects of jail stays, especially for low-level offenses?
Sure. Real quick, I just want to add a little caveat to the statistic you gave of half of all criminal prosecutions are for traffic offenses. I just want to make clear that that's non-safety related traffic offenses. So that does not include OWIs. That does not include DUIs. So it's even more out of whack than you would think. It's these things that it's driving on a suspended license and it's driving without insurance. Those are the two most common misdemeanor charges around traffic that happen. And yeah, so I think that the results of, you know, the results of a stay in jail is sort of, I hope, somewhat self-evident, but I think it bears repeating, right? A single night in jail. So I have a number of clients who they are on their way to work. They get stopped, they get arrested, they spend the night in jail. They are arraigned and they are released on a personal bond literally the next day, maybe 2 days later. This happens all the time to my clients. They'll lose their job over that. One no-show is sometimes all it takes to get fired. And not just sometimes. When you work a minimum wage job, when you work, I mean, I don't want to suggest that my clients are only people who work minimum wage jobs. I have clients who are welders. I have clients who are skilled tradespeople who a night in jail and their job is gone. And so I have clients, for example, I'm thinking of the welder. He's a career welder. He lost his job at one warehouse where he welded the truck, like, I'm clearly a lawyer and not an auto manufacturer, I apologize. But he welded some piece of the chassis of a truck. He lost that job because he spent, I think, 2 weeks in jail, pre-trial, on a driving on a suspended license charge. He was pulled over and they arraigned him and they set a bond that he could not afford to pay. So they set a $500 bond and he could not afford to pay a $500 bond. He was held for 2 weeks until he was able to plead guilty at his pre-trial. And keep in mind that the sentence that he received when he pled involved no jail time, but he was held because he couldn't pay a $500 bond for 2 weeks. He lost that job, came to us. He had actually already done a program that Detroit has to get his license suspensions lifted, but the program, as much good as it does, it's still, the process is so confusing to get your license reinstated that he still had not yet, even though he owed no money.
Let's see, I think we're losing Jeff here briefly on technical grounds, but I want to circle back to the reinstatement point, because I think it's really important to understand that it's not just the original suspension, it's how do you get your license back that's critically important. And it can be very expensive and very burdensome to do that. I'm going to go to Kristine. Kristine, do you have a sense, just in dollar terms, of how expensive it can be to get your license reinstated? I don't have those numbers in front of me.
It could be thousands of dollars. I mean, oftentimes, and more importantly, you could be in a situation where you're not eligible to get your license back, right? And you have to wait an extended amount of time. You have to pay the fines and costs for whatever the initial assessment was by the court, as well as any other fees and court costs. And let's remember, it's a misdemeanor, right? And so you might get a fine, but you might have to also pay probationary fees for whatever reason. I mean, I don't know why a person needs to be on probation because they drove without a license, but that said, right? And then, so it could be thousands of dollars.
That's wild. So I think we got Jeff back, and I want to give him the chance to finish his thought. But Jeff, we were just talking about the reinstatement fees, which I think is an important subsidiary issue here.
Yeah, I mean, I think they'd probably cut me off because I was telling far too long of a story. The long and the short of it is that a single day in jail, even less than 24 hours, and you can lose your job. You can, as Kristen already pointed out, so you can lose your kids. You can, there's a whole number of consequences can cascade. I think the other thing that's important to remember, right, is a lot of our clients get their car impounded when they get arrested.
Sure.
Even if they don't get arrested, I watched a police video of a police officer making a woman walk home to Detroit from 15 Mile out of Warren because they impounded her car because she was driving on a suspended license. And she got very sick from that walk because it was very cold. And she couldn't afford to get her car out of the impound. And so she was out of car. She said she just had to, I couldn't afford it. I had to let it go. And so that's, that places a whole other barrier on people. And I think just I found some statistics that I think I'd like to end on, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
So in the most comprehensive study that they did of the effect of license suspensions was in New Jersey in 2007. And 42% of people who had their license suspended lost their job immediately after their license was suspended. And 88% of those people who did find new employment, 88% had a decrease in income in the amount of in their employment. So I think it's just important to think about that as an impact, right? Like those are very real numbers. Yeah,
and it's just, these aren't things that a person who hasn't lived through them or worked with people that have knows about. It's just not known, and it's happening every day to thousands of people. And this is our opportunity as a state to start fixing some of these things. And I want to circle around now to Representative Colley because she's got bills on these issues. And I want to say, Representative Colley, can you tell us about the recommendations that came out of the task force to address people going to jail for suspended licenses and how they're reflected in your bill, HB 5846?
Sure. So when we're talking about the issue of license suspension, the main recommendation that came out of the task force was drawing a bright line between dangerous driving and then other conduct. So put simply, if it isn't dangerous driving, then your license shouldn't be suspended for it. There's a very simple way to put the whole intent of the bill, which was, again, one of the main recommendations of the task force. And we're hearing why, as we're talking about it today, that is important for a lot of different reasons. So if someone doesn't pay a fine or a fee, if they miss a court date that was set for collection of a fine or a fee, the fact is the license suspension isn't going to resolve the issue.
Right.
And so, in fact, it's going to make it worse. And Kristine and Jeff have given some real examples of this. So there's other ways to hold people accountable. And we're having conversations about that right now with stakeholders. But up to and including even an arrest warrant, that's still possible for people who stay away from the court long enough. So why suspend the license for those things? So on the other hand, and this cannot be overemphasized, I think we all agree that there is some conduct where people should have their license suspended. I mean, if you drive drunk, or if you drive recklessly, as David Gunther said, if you're driving 110 miles per hour in the 55 mile per hour zone, that's the reckless driving. Or if you hurt or kill someone while you're driving or with your car, or even if you just rack up enough points from a lot of tickets, speeding tickets, and it shows that you can't be trusted on the roads, then it makes sense to have your license suspended. That's a direct correlation there. So my bill, that House Bill 5846, would maintain the suspension for all those reasons. It would keep the suspension there for those reasons. And that was a big priority for me. Safety, public safety is important and it needs to be upheld, but we also need common sense here. So when I took up this bill, that was foremost in my mind too. And again, that was also a big priority of the task force. So I'll just note that there are 6 other bills in this task force package that address license suspensions, but they all adhere to the same concept. Suspend licenses for bad driving and not for any other reasons.
Sure. You know, as I think Jeff said in the introductions, I mean, most people think the law already draws these distinctions, right? And it's just not true.
Right.
So I'm going to go to David next. Some people may wonder, if we stop suspending licenses for these types of debts, how will the money get collected and how can people be held accountable? David, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, it's not about removing accountability. That's one thing that is kind of a mistaken understanding, that if you're talking about limiting the number of types of things that can cause someone to get their license suspended, that, and it's something that we've been conscious to have the conversation, that the end result of what we do policy-wise needs to be more people being accountable for their behavior. And it's kind of like what we saw with the whole prison reform and things in Texas, is that we were doing a number of things at a policy level that didn't accomplish the objectives of what we were trying to do, and that we were giving a pass for a particular sector of government, that we were not holding them to the same standards that we were for other categories of government, because criminal justice and public safety was a core government function. So what we need to be looking at are, what are ways that we can encourage more compliance with the courts, and also ensure that people are meeting the requirements. I mean, even something as simple as sending court reminders that, hey, you had a court date, you didn't show up, we're rescheduling it, you really need to show up this time.
Right.
And then maybe have the hammer behind that, okay, if you don't show up, then we'll put an arrest warrant out for you. But also be looking at things that we can be doing as alternatives to fines and fees, that perhaps allow people more opportunities to use community service to work those things off, to have a prioritization of restitution to victims, things of that sort, and have the threat of jail time as a hammer to ensure compliance with that. And it's important to know that courts can also issue arrest warrants if people are away for too long. And that if people know that that is something that is hanging out there as a possibility, if they continue to ignore the stuff that they're being responsible to do to the courts, those sorts of things ought to be used to try to keep jail from becoming more of a front-end default.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that jail is really the default itself, and there's really no inquiry into a person's culpability or ability to pay. It's just they go to jail and then they ask those questions. And it would be nice if we set the system up in the other direction. So Jeff, I'm going to go to you next. Representative Colley's bill is really tackling the suspension issue head on. Are there other policies or areas that legislators should consider with regards to removing barriers for safe drivers to keep driving?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I want to say, like, Rep. Colley's bill is excellent. I think removing this, removing license suspensions as a penalty is such an enormous step. And it's very, very exciting to have started doing this work 2 years ago and see a bill this soon. We don't get results normally that quick, so I'm very excited about that. But I think what I would say is thinking about sort of what's sort of actually going on in a lot of these courts is something that's really important. We wrote a report called Highway Robbery that I would recommend everyone to check out. I can put a link in the chat as soon as I'm done talking. That has I think 13 recommendations to sort of address this issue. And I think, a point that you and David were both making that I think is really, really important in thinking about this, right, is that what these traffic courts often are is they're a de facto funding unit for cities. And what they do is they work with the police and the mayor to essentially tax the people who are both least able to pay, but also least politically powerful in these jurisdictions. At least in Metro Detroit, what you have is cities that are sort of reaping huge amounts of money from poor Black drivers from Detroit. And so those are people who can't vote in that local municipality, but then are being turned around and asked to fund it at the threat of jail. And what that looks like in practice, right, is you mentioned that people go to jail and then they're asked if they're able to pay. They're not asked if they're able to pay. That question is never raised in court. So what you have is, right, so Plymouth, great example, Plymouth, it's if you get convicted of driving on a suspended license, it is a flat $850 fine. For somebody in Detroit, or excuse me, for somebody who like the client I'm thinking of who experienced this, a family of three, she's the only income, she makes just above the poverty line, so about $23,000 a year. For somebody with a median income in Plymouth, an $850 fine is the equivalent of a $3,200 fine. So I don't think I could pay a $3,200 fine if it suddenly popped up. I mean, let me rephrase that. I know for a fact I couldn't pay a $3,200 fine if it just popped up. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that there's no inquiry into ability to pay. And just so you know, when I was representing this client in Plymouth and I raised this issue with the judge, off the record, the judge said, if I started waiving fines and fees, this court would financially implode. And so I think that is important to remember, right? That this is about cities and towns that want to keep a low tax rate for the wealthy people who live there and for the businesses that live there, still provide good services for the town. And so what they do is they look to people who are commuting through their city to raise money. And there are a couple ways that I think we can really easily fix that. I think a major way to do that is to actually index fines and fees to people's real economic circumstance, right? So if to middle-class people like us, a $20 fine, that seems crazy as a penalty. I could do that every day, but that's how we feel about speeding tickets. Mm-hmm. And realistically, for a poor person, $20 is a lot of money.
Yeah. And
so I think it's setting it up so that fines and fees are actually indexed to be exactly sort of what we think they should be as a penalty and as an incentive based on a person's actual economic circumstance, right? Because it's not a real incentive if it's $850 is just an unpayable amount of money to somebody who can't afford to pay $850, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is courts have to be stopped from being self-funding. That's crazy. Judges are not looking at people as individual defendants. They're not making assessments as to whether or not things are right and wrong. They're looking at people as money. And I want to be clear, this is not all judges. There are a lot of very, very good judges. And in fact, those good judges wrote an amicus brief to the Supreme Court talking about the fear that they face going into their city council hearings, being told you need to raise money for us. Yeah. So the judges that are good are on board on this, and they've been very clear about that. And I think the last thing I'll say is that if we want people to drive safely, they need to have insurance. And as we know, insurance rates are both the highest in the country in Michigan. They're the highest in the country in Detroit.
Yep.
And that there's a whole racist legacy that goes into that. But I think more importantly, there's just got to be a program that provides affordable insurance to poor people.
Yeah.
And there are states that have this. California has a very, very effective insurance program that we point to in our paper that provides affordable insurance for low-income people. And it's amazing how much they've reduced a whole number of things, including people driving without insurance, based on that program. And it's relative, and that's the other thing, right? It's relatively low cost and it's an easy solution. So, and it's definitely, and keep in mind, right, under Michigan's current law, we pay out those insurance claims if somebody gets in an accident and doesn't have insurance. So I have clients who,
Right.
they did get in an accident. They should have paid for the damages that were caused by that accident. The state of Michigan paid for it. In one client's case, they paid $10,000. And they're still trying to collect that money from him because he can't afford to pay $10,000. He couldn't afford to pay the premiums for his insurance, and he can't afford to pay $10,000. So a much cheaper solution would be to create an insurance program he could afford. And then on the off chance he gets in an accident, instead of the state paying out that claim, the insurance that has been funded, that he has been paying into, pays out that claim.
Right.
So,
Right. And yeah, so just so everyone on the webinar knows, the link to the report that Jeff mentioned is in the chat. David just mentioned in the chat as well that the insurance reforms from last year are going into effect soon. And I'll note a couple other things just for posterity here. On the court funding issue, there was a task force on that, and they put out a report, I think it was last year. The current state court administrator, Judge Boyd, was the chair of that. And it's a really good report. It addresses some of these issues. And one of the major recommendations is that we should not be funding courts on fines and fees. I hope we see legislation on that. I hope we see it soon. And that's certainly something that we at Safe and Just Michigan will be working on. So I see we're about 7 minutes before 1, and I want to keep moving here. I'm going to go to Kristine next. One of the big reasons for getting a license suspended is unpaid tickets. Can you explain some of the costs someone might see if they interact with the criminal justice system and the role of money in it more broadly?
So the role of money, I don't think that there's, so let's say it like this. If you have unpaid tickets and for some reason you get arrested, right? So, and maybe you get arrested because of something unrelated to those tickets, right? So then you get a cash bail or bond. Got to pay that. But okay, so then these tickets create what we call holds, right? And so one of the things that I see a lot as it relates to these costs and fees is you have a series of holds, and oftentimes suburban courts, and they're almost impossible to lift, right? Without just paying them or without physically bringing the person before the court, which is a high task. In terms of the additional fees and costs, okay, so you have higher insurance rates. That's it, if you can even get insurance, right? You have rates, and this is one thing that a lot of people don't talk about. There's a cost associated with homeowners insurance, right? Because people, a lot of the insurance companies look at your credit score, etc., right? And so I think, but what I always say is that you cannot discount the human cost. There's a certain amount of humiliation that comes with not being able to financially afford your obligations, right? There is a certain amount of, I don't want to say, it takes something away from a person's spirit. If every day there is this challenge, there's this thing hanging over their head and they can't figure out a way out of it, right? And so it creates these deeper issues, and they become more far-reaching, and they, up in individuals' lives in ways that I don't think ordinary people understand. people who have who are far removed from the criminal justice system.
I think that's very well put. And, you know, we've seen research recently on life expectancy, you know, based on a person's income, and the disparity between the highest levels and the lowest, it's something like 20 years. And that's not even getting into sort of the ways in which stress impacts day-to-day decision-making. And there's just a lot to unpack there. I appreciate you saying that. So I'm gonna go to Ripkali next. I wanted to sort of go to a more national perspective. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the ways in which the suspension issue is especially bad in Michigan, but it's not unique to Michigan, is it? It's a problem lots of places.
Yeah, it truly is. License suspension isn't unique just to Michigan, although it is certainly a big issue right here in our own state. But we're not alone. It's true across the entire country, red states, blue states, doesn't matter. It's a big issue across the board. In fact, there are 44 states, including Michigan, that have laws that allow licenses to be suspended or revoked just for unpaid fees or fines. And I have this little statistic here. Across the country, researchers estimate that 11 million Americans, let that number sink in, nationally, 11 million Americans have a suspended license for unpaid fees and fines or for missing a court date. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to talk about Michigan and our national status with the auto insurance. Just briefly, I want to touch on that as a note of encouragement. Because yes, we have had the highest auto insurance rates in the country, and yes, Detroit was the highest in the state. So it was really hitting that area hard. And last May, sweeping bipartisan reforms were signed into law that take effect on July 1st. So very shortly, that will bring rates down for all drivers across the state at varying levels of reduction depending on what drivers choose. So that was something that people said could never happen. And it did happen, and that should help all drivers, but particularly lower income drivers, because insurance is a bigger proportion of the income. So that is a positive. But going back to license suspension, again, being a national issue, our ranking, if you will, on this is about average. We're similar to Wisconsin. We suspend about 50 licenses for failing to pay fines and fees or failure to appear in court for every 1,000 drivers. I think that's a really high number myself.
Yeah, sure.
You know, 50 drivers for every 1,000 drivers in our state. But we don't want to be average. We don't want to be average in anything in our state. And we certainly don't want to be just average when it comes to this topic either. So we can be better. I am excited that it appears we're on the pathway to be better, which will help people, and it will also inadvertently and all a full circle and upholds the economy and helps our workforce. It's a complete picture that we're addressing here on all fronts. And we've got some other states we can look to for examples. We've got Montana, you have Texas, Virginia, Mississippi. They have all passed reforms to reduce license suspension just in the past couple of years. And currently there are 2 states that are near us, Wisconsin and Illinois. They have recently introduced legislation this session to do the same thing like we have. So I also want to mention, when it comes to this topic nationally, we started out, or at least I started out, talking about how I was struck by the diversity of support for this issue that we're seeing, coming from all spectrums. So in the last couple of years, about 100 diverse, and I mean diverse, I'll name some of them, organizations have joined together to launch something called the Free to Drive campaign. They have an excellent website. In fact, we'll try to put that link in the chat box for the Free to Drive campaign. But some of the supporters of this would be the Koch Industries and the ACLU that are putting some funding behind it. And it has a ton of great information on their site about how states across the country compare on the issue of license suspension. And I really encourage people to check that out. So we want to get Michigan to be better than average in every area, but definitely this one too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're at 1 o'clock. This is time when I often go to questions, and we're running a little over, but I think it's important just, to touch on a couple additional issues. The first one is, we've seen really good data coming out of Michigan on COVID infections. They're declining substantially. We're actually leading the nation in those, but that's not happening in our prisons and jails in the same way. And I was hoping we could just touch briefly, David, on the particular concerns around COVID-19 in jails and how the recommendations of the task force would help address some of those concerns, not all of them, but some.
I'll be brief. Next, only behind nursing homes, correctional facilities are kind of what you would call either a hot zone or disease vector, because you've got people who are coming in and out at a high frequency, well, not necessarily in prisons, but in jails, but you have people in very close quarters. You don't have the frequency of sanitation. You can't socially distance. Those are the conditions that lead to the spread of disease through a population, especially when you don't have access to masks, other PPE, cleaning supplies, et cetera. And so if you're wanting to limit the spread of a virus of the nature of COVID-19, then you need to be looking at ways to strategically reduce the populations within the prisons. And I think a lot of the things that we've been talking about as far as licensing and those sorts of things will be a long-term solution. But what you've seen is some of the counties in Michigan have looked at the recommendations of the task force and decided, let's test these on our own. And so you're seeing cases such as Kalamazoo, Wayne County, and even rural counties like Benzie and Alpena that are experimenting with the recommendations and are cutting their jail populations in half. Macomb County is about 2/3. And that as we're seeing that we're able to keep compliance with the court system and not seeing a spike in crime, that I think those will help the argument for adopting these permanently and statewide.
Absolutely. I think that's a terrific point, and I want to just amplify it briefly. I mean, one of the sort of like overarching conclusions the task force had was that we're just sending too many people to jail, and it's not rooted in public safety reasons. And there's all kinds of consequences to that. In the pandemic, obviously, it has public health consequences. But we're also seeing, for years and years, and folks in Detroit know this, there's been a conversation about building a new Wayne County jail at the cost of $500 million. And turns out we didn't need all those jail beds. And Macomb actually had plans to build a new jail and shelved them because they didn't need it. And with counties spending $500 million a year, that's another finding from the task force, on their jails, I think just like Texas did 12, 15 years ago, there really needs to be a reckoning about whether these are needed and whether we can be putting our resources elsewhere. So I've got one more question, and I'm going to go to Kristine to close us out before Q&A. So the events of the past few weeks have made issues of racial disparities in the justice system, particularly with regard to policing, top of mind for many people. Can you talk about how the issue of license suspensions intersects with this broader conversation?
So the license suspension gets to an encounter with the police, right? And so much of what we need to talk about, but just aside from license suspension, is decriminalizing ordinary everyday things. When you look at George Floyd, a counterfeit $20 bill is an arrestable offense. And we could go on. Someone selling loose cigarettes, right? Someone loitering, playing music too loud. What the police determine the offense, and then they have the ability to arrest you. They have the ability to take your life, right? And so one of the things that you see in this movement, in this protest, is that unequivocally, people got to see what an encounter with the police looks like that kills someone. And I think that for a long time, people really didn't realize like what it feels like, the fear, the apprehension, and to be a person of color in these United States and to have that experience. You know, I am married to a lawyer, and he is a criminal defense lawyer, but he's also a Black man in America. And if the police pull him over, he's clutching the steering wheel. And so when you talk about a license suspension, to me, aside from the economic cost, it's the fact that you now have an encounter with the police, and it's discretionary whether or not they let you go, right? And what we know for sure, and what I know for sure, is that in certain communities, if the police stop you and your license is suspended, they may take you home, right? Instead of to jail. And so we have to really put real consideration into what we're doing when we're giving someone the power to arrest you simply because you don't have a driver's license.
Yes, absolutely. We normally do a Q&A at this point in time. We've got a handful of questions. I think I just want to leave us with what Kristine said. We will get answers to questions out to people maybe over the next few days, but I really appreciate the conversation we had today. These are critically important issues, and I hope we can use the webinar today to really spread the word about the issues we're trying to address with the legislation in the state legislature, and what the task force was trying to address. It's critically important to hundreds of thousands of people in Michigan, and we just need to fix these problems. So thanks everybody, and I'll hand it off to Josh to read us out.
Safe and Just Michigan thanks you for participating in today's event. We'll be hosting more webinars on the jail's task force. Please keep an eye out for those later in the summer. On the screen, we have included several ways that you can keep in contact with Safe and Just Michigan. They're also available to you in the chat box. We look forward to connecting with you soon. Thanks again for participating in today's panel.